Jeremiah Clearwater didn't ride into Copper Ridge that scorching August morning planning to become anyone's savior. But when he saw four native sisters chained together on that auction platform like livestock, something inside his war-scarred soul shattered completely. He raised his weathered hand, called out a bid that silenced the entire crowd, and with that single desperate choice changed 5 lives forever in ways none of them could have imagined. The Arizona Territory's sun beat down mercilessly on Copper Ridge, a ramshackle frontier town that had sprouted like a poisonous weed around the richest copper veins anyone had ever seen carved into the red mesa walls. The year was 1878, and civilization here was nothing more than a thin veneer painted over greed, violence, and the kind of moral bankruptcy that thrived in places where law arrived months after the lawless had already claimed everything worth taking.
Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you.
Dust devils danced between the wooden buildings that lined Main Street, carrying the stench of unwashed bodies, rotting garbage, and the acrid smoke that poured constantly from Ezra Blackstone's copper smelting operations on the eastern edge of town. Blackstone owned everything that mattered in Copper Ridge, from the mines that employed half the territory to the saloons that separated miners from their wages, and his influence reached deep into the territorial government where judges and lawmakers danced to whatever tune his money played. The town square buzzed with the kind of excited energy that only came on auction days, when anything and everything could be bought, sold, or traded for the right price. Livestock, farm equipment, furniture from families that had given up and headed back east. And sometimes, when Blackstone's influence made it possible, human beings who had been classified as something less than citizens under territorial law. Jeremiah Jeb Clearwater sat astride his bay gelding at the edge of the crowd, his steel-gray eyes scanning the chaos with the practiced alertness of a man who had learned that survival depended on seeing trouble before it saw you. At 36, his face bore the deep lines of someone who had witnessed too much death and carried too many regrets, the kind of weathering that came not just from sun and wind, but from the weight of decisions that haunted a man's sleep for years afterward. He had ridden into Copper Ridge for supplies and nothing more, his saddlebags empty except for the modest stake he had managed to save from 3 years of backbreaking work on his small cattle ranch 40 miles north in the shadow of the Mogollon Rim. The ranch was barely profitable, just enough cattle to keep him fed and clothed, but it was honest work that let him sleep at night, without reaching for the whiskey bottle that had nearly destroyed him after the war. Jeb had served as a Union cavalry scout during the final bloody years of the Civil War, riding reconnaissance through hostile territory where a single mistake meant death or worse. He had seen the aftermath of battles where men had been reduced to numbers in casualty reports, witnessed the casual cruelty that war brought out in otherwise decent people, and participated in actions that the government called necessary, but that his conscience called something else entirely. The memories followed him like faithful hounds, appearing without warning in the middle of peaceful moments to remind him of choices that couldn't be undone. After Appomattox, he had drifted west like so many other veterans who couldn't find their place in a peacetime world that seemed to have no use for men whose primary skills involved violence and survival. He had tried his hand at marshalling, bounty hunting, and even a brief stint as a hired gun before the morning he woke up in a Tucson jail cell with no memory of the previous 3 days and blood under his fingernails that might not have been his own. That moment of horrifying clarity had forced him to confront what he was becoming and what he still might choose to be. The decision to disappear into the mountains and build something instead of destroying it had been the hardest choice of his life, requiring him to turn his back on the only skills that had kept him alive for nearly 2 decades. The cattle ranch was his attempt at redemption, a place where he could prove to himself, and maybe to God, that he was capable of something better than the violence that had defined his adult existence. The auctioneer, a sweaty man named Fergus, McKinnon, who had made a career out of separating fools from their money, climbed onto the wooden platform that served as Copper Ridge's commercial center and began his familiar routine of calling the crowd to order. McKinnon had the voice of a carnival barker and the morals of a riverboat gambler, equally comfortable selling a prize bull or a desperate widow's wedding ring to the highest bidder. His reputation for creative descriptions of damaged goods had made him wealthy, if not respected. The morning's offerings began with the usual assortment of goods that represented the dreams and failures of frontier life. Farm tools that had proven inadequate to the harsh reality of desert agriculture, furniture that families had carried across half the continent only to abandon when their money ran out, and livestock that bore the brands of ranchers who had discovered that cattle required more water than the Arizona Territory was willing to provide. Each item told a story of hope deferred or destroyed by the unforgiving realities of frontier existence. Jeb watched with mild interest as a decent saddle went for twice what it was worth, and a team of oxen that looked ready for the glue factory somehow attracted serious bidding from newcomers who didn't know enough to examine the animals before opening their wallets. The crowd was the usual mixture of established ranchers looking for bargains, merchants hoping to acquire inventory, and drifters who attended auctions for the entertainment value of watching other people make expensive mistakes. As the morning progressed, Jeb began to notice an undercurrent of tension that went beyond the normal excitement of competitive bidding. Conversations stopped abruptly when strangers approached. Meaningful glances were exchanged between men who obviously shared some knowledge that hadn't been announced from the platform, and there was a sense of anticipation building towards something that McKinnon was clearly saving for the climax of his show. The regular attendees seemed to know what was coming, while newcomers like Jeb remained in the dark. The answer came when Ezra Blackstone himself appeared at the edge of the platform, his black suit and silver-headed cane marking him as clearly as a uniform marked a soldier. Blackstone was a man in his 50s who had built his fortune on the principle that everything and everyone had a price, and that price was usually lower than people imagined if you applied the right kind of pressure at the right moment. His presence at the auction meant that something extraordinary was about to happen. McKinnon's voice dropped to a theatrical whisper that somehow carried to every corner of the square as he announced the final lot of the day, a special offering that had been made possible through the generosity and legal expertise of Mr. Ezra Blackstone, who had gone to considerable trouble and expense to ensure that today's auction would be remembered for years to come. The auctioneer's words were carefully chosen to sound official and legal while revealing nothing about the true nature of what was about to transpire. 4 figures were led onto the platform by 2 of Blackstone's hired men, and Jeb felt something cold and sick twist in his stomach as he realized what he was seeing. 4 Native American girls, ranging in age from what looked like barely 12 to perhaps 19, chained together at the wrists with iron shackles that had left angry red marks on their brown skin. The sight was so shocking, so fundamentally wrong, that for a moment Jeb wondered if he was experiencing some kind of whiskey-induced hallucination. The eldest girl, who Jeb would later learn was named Winona, carried herself with a dignity that the chains couldn't diminish despite her obvious exhaustion and fear. She had long black hair that had been roughly braided and dark, eyes that burned with a fury that seemed barely contained by her circumstances. She stood protectively in front of the others, as if her body could somehow shield them from the dozens of eyes that examined them, like livestock being evaluated for purchase. The second girl, Talia, had the lean build of someone who had grown up knowing hunger, but had never let it break her spirit, and her gaze moved constantly across the crowd, as if she were memorizing faces and calculating odds, the way a poker player studied the cards in her hand. There was intelligence in her expression that suggested she understood exactly what was happening and was already planning her response, looking for weaknesses in her captor's arrangements. The third girl, Chenoa, appeared to be about 14, with gentler features and eyes that held a sadness so deep it seemed to have settled into her bones.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us now. Back to the story.
But there was something else there too. A strength that manifested itself in the way she kept one hand on the shoulder of the youngest girl, offering comfort even while trapped in her own nightmare. She whispered something in what Jeep assumed was their native language, words that seemed to provide some small measure of reassurance. The youngest, Kaya, couldn't have been more than 12, with the kind of bright curiosity that should have been focused on games and learning, but had instead been forced to confront horrors that no child should ever witness. Despite everything, she maintained a spark of defiance that suggested her spirit hadn't been completely crushed by whatever circumstances had brought her to this platform. Her eyes darted around the crowd with the wariness of a wild animal trapped in an unfamiliar environment. McKinnon launched into his sales pitch with the enthusiasm of a man who had learned to divorce his conscience from his profession, describing the 4 girls as a complete family unit, perfect for households that needed reliable domestic help with the added advantage of being unable to simply walk away when the work became difficult or the treatment became harsh. His words were carefully chosen to make the transaction sound legitimate, while everyone present understood the true nature of what was being offered. He emphasized their supposed training in cooking, cleaning, and other household tasks, while carefully avoiding any mention of how they had come to be available for purchase, or what legal fiction had been used to classify them as property rather than human beings. The territorial laws were deliberately vague on such matters, providing just enough ambiguity for men like Blackstone to exploit while maintaining the pretense of operating within the bounds of civilization. The bidding started at $50 for the entire group, a price that McKinnon described as generous given the current market conditions and the quality of the merchandise being offered. Several hands went up immediately, including those of ranchers who Jeb recognized as men who treated their horses better than their hired help. The casual way they bid on human lives filled him with a rage that he hadn't felt since the war. As the price climbed toward $100, Jeb found himself studying the faces of the bidders and feeling increasingly sick at what he saw. These weren't men looking for household help or even farm laborers. These were predators who had recognized an opportunity to acquire victims who would have no legal recourse and no hope of escape or rescue. The hunger in their eyes was unmistakable and deeply disturbing. One bidder, a fat man in a stained vest who owned several saloons in nearby mining camps, made lewd comments about the girls, potential uses that caused several people in the crowd to laugh, while others looked away in shame. Another bidder, a rancher known for his violent treatment of Mexican workers, speculated openly about how long it would take to break their spirit completely. The casual cruelty of their words made Jeb's hands clench into fists. Winona seemed to sense the direction of his thoughts, because her burning gaze found his face in the crowd and held it for a moment that felt like an eternity. In that brief connection, Jeb saw a desperate plea for help, a recognition that he might be different from the others, and a challenge to prove that there was still some trace of decency left in a world that had seemingly abandoned its moral compass entirely. The weight of that gaze was like a physical blow. When the bidding reached $150, Jeb surprised himself by raising his hand and calling out, "200, in a voice that carried clearly across the suddenly quiet square. The words seemed to come from someone else, someone who hadn't spent 3 years trying to avoid exactly this kind of moral confrontation. But once spoken, they couldn't be taken back, and Jeb found himself committed to a course of action that would change everything. The silence that followed his bid was broken only by the sound of wind moving through the wooden buildings and the distant noise of machinery from Blackstone's mining operations. McKinnon looked genuinely surprised, as if he hadn't expected serious competition for his human merchandise, while several of the other bidders turned to stare at the stranger, who had just raised the stakes beyond their comfort level. The tension in the square was suddenly thick enough to cut with a knife, Ezra Blackstone stepped forward, his pale eyes fixed on Jeb with the intensity of a predator evaluating potential prey, and asked in a voice that carried just enough threat. "To be unmistakable, you planning to outbid everyone here, stranger, or just making noise for the entertainment value?" The question was delivered with a smile that never reached his eyes, and Jeb recognized the tone of a man who was accustomed to getting his way through intimidation. Jeb met Blackstone's stare without flinching, drawing on reserves of courage that he hadn't accessed since his cavalry days, and replied, "I'm planning to take those girls home with me today, and I'll pay whatever it takes to make that happen, assuming you're running an honest auction and not just putting on a show for your entertainment." The challenge in his words was clear enough that several men in the crowd began shifting nervously, recognizing the kind of tension that preceded violence. McKinnon, sensing that his auction was about to become something much more dangerous, quickly called for any higher bids, while obviously hoping that cooler heads would prevail. When no one responded to the auctioneer's increasingly desperate calls, the fat saloon owner started to raise his hand again, but a single look from Jeb made him reconsider. The rancher, who had been speculating about breaking spirits, also seemed to lose his enthusiasm for the proceedings. Jeb pulled a leather pouch from his saddlebags and counted out $200 in gold coins, the entire proceeds from his spring cattle sale that he had planned to use for winter supplies and improvements to his ranch. The money represented months of hard work and careful saving, but as he looked at the 4 girls on the platform, he knew that some purchases were worth more than their financial cost. This was one of those moments when a man discovered what he truly valued. As McKinnon handed over the ownership papers and the key to the girls' shackles, Blackstone moved close enough to Jeb that his words wouldn't carry to the crowd and said quietly, "You just made a very expensive mistake, stranger, and expensive mistakes have a way of becoming fatal ones in places like Copper Ridge. So I hope you're prepared for the consequences of your heroic impulses." The threat was delivered with the casual confidence of a man who had eliminated obstacles before. Jeb pocketed the key and the papers before responding in an equally quiet voice, "I've been making expensive mistakes my entire adult life, Mr. Blackstone, and I'm still here to tell about them, so I reckon I'll take my chances with whatever consequences you have in mind." The words carried the weight of a man who had faced death before and survived, to make his own choices about what was worth fighting for. The weight of the ownership papers in Jeb's coat pocket felt heavier than any military dispatch he had ever carried, and the iron key to the girl's shackles seemed to burn against his palm as he approached the platform, where 4 pairs of dark eyes watched his every movement with a mixture of hope and terror. The crowd began to disperse with the disappointed grumbling of men who had been denied their entertainment, but Jeb could feel dozens of hostile stares boring into his back as he climbed the wooden steps to claim what he had purchased. Winona stood perfectly still as he approached, her chin raised in defiance despite the chains that bound her wrists, and when he spoke her name as gently as he could manage, she flinched as if expecting a blow. "I'm Jeb Clearwater," he said in a voice barely above a whisper, "and I'm going to get those chains off you right now. But I need you to trust me for just a moment longer." Her eyes searched his face for any sign of deception, and he could see the terrible calculation she was making about whether this stranger represented salvation or simply a different kind of damnation. The key turned easily in the lock mechanism, and the shackles fell away from Winona's wrists with a metallic clatter that seemed to echo across the now quiet square. She rubbed the raw skin where the iron had chafed, never taking her eyes off Jeb's face, and he could see the moment when she realized that he wasn't reaching for new restraints or making demands about her behavior. Instead, he moved to Talia, whose intelligent eyes had been tracking every detail of his movements, analyzing his intentions with the careful attention of someone whose survival had depended on reading people correctly. As each girl was freed from her chains, Jeb noticed how they instinctively moved closer together, forming a protective huddle with Winona at the front and Kaya safely surrounded by her older sisters. They had learned to depend on each other completely, and the bond between them was so strong that it seemed to create its own gravity, pulling them into a formation that maximized their collective security while maintaining their ability to flee, if necessary, leading 4 traumatized girls through the streets of Copper Ridge toward the livery stable where he had left his wagon required more courage than charging Confederate positions had ever demanded, because every face they passed seemed to hold judgment, curiosity, or outright hostility. Word of the auction had spread quickly through the town, and Jeb could see curtains twitching in windows as residents craned their necks to get a better look at the man who had disrupted their entertainment, and the girls who had been the subject of it. The livery stable owner, a grizzled man named Pete Hawkins, who had lost his left arm in a mining accident and made up for it with twice the normal amount of suspicion, looked up from shoeing a horse and fixed Jeb with a stare that could have melted copper ore. "Heard you caused quite a stir at the auction today, Clearwater," he said around the nails he held between his teeth. "Hope you know what you're getting yourself into with those 4, because there's folks in this town who ain't going to appreciate your interference in their business affairs." Jeb paid for his wagon and team without responding to the implied threat, but he noticed how Hawkins made a point of examining each of the girls with the kind of lingering attention that made his skin crawl. Winona seemed to sense the man's intentions as well, because she positioned herself between him and her sisters while maintaining the alert posture of someone ready to fight or flee at a moment's notice. The stable felt suddenly oppressive, filled with shadows that seemed to harbor watching eyes. The wagon ride out of Copper Ridge took them past Blackstone's mining operations, where hundreds of workers toiled in conditions that would have been considered inhumane for livestock, and Jeb couldn't help but notice how many of those workers were Mexican or Native American men whose legal status was probably as questionable as the girls had been. Smoke and dust rose from the excavations like offerings to some industrial deity that demanded constant sacrifice in exchange for copper and profit. Talia was the first to speak as they cleared the outskirts of town, her voice carrying a musical quality despite the obvious strain of recent trauma. "Where are you taking us?" she asked in English that was accented but perfectly clear, and Jeb realized that she had been silent not because she couldn't communicate, but because she had been evaluating whether it was safe to reveal her capabilities. Intelligence was often seen as a threat in people who were expected to be property. "To my ranch," Jeb replied, keeping his voice level and non-threatening. "About a day's ride north of here, up in the mountains where the air is cleaner and the water runs year-round. It's not much to look at, but it's peaceful, and nobody bothers you if you don't bother them." He paused, choosing his next words carefully. "You'll be safe there while we figure out what comes next, and I give you my word that no harm will come to any of you while you're under my protection." As the miles passed and the immediate danger of Copper Ridge faded behind them, the girls began to relax slightly, though Jeb noticed that they never completely let down their guard. Chenoa was the first to show signs of the trauma they had endured, her hands shaking uncontrollably whenever a sudden noise startled her, and Kaya kept looking back over her shoulder as if expecting pursuit from enemies who might materialize. Out of the desert landscape, it was during a rest stop beside a small creek that Winona finally spoke at length, her voice carrying the weight of someone who had been forced to grow up far too quickly. "We are Chiricahua Apache," she said, using the English words carefully as if testing their weight. "From the Dragoon Mountains, before the soldiers came and burned our village because they said we were harboring raiders who attacked the mining camps." The simple statement contained volumes of tragedy and injustice that Jeb recognized from his own experience with military operations. "Our parents died in the fighting," Talia continued, her voice steady despite the pain that flickered in her eyes, "and the soldiers rounded up the survivors and marched us to the reservation at San Carlos, where they said we would be fed and clothed in exchange for staying put and causing no more trouble." The reservation system was supposedly designed to protect Native Americans, but Jeb had heard enough stories to know that protection often looked remarkably similar to imprisonment. Chenoa's voice was softer when she took up the narrative, speaking in tones that suggested she had been the family's peacemaker and healer. The agent at San Carlos was supposed to provide food and medicine, but most of what the government sent disappeared before it reached us, and children began dying from diseases that could have been easily treated. Her words painted a picture of systematic neglect that was designed to solve the Indian problem through attrition rather than violence. When Blackstone's men came to the reservation, Kaya said with the matter-of-fact tone that children used to describe horrors they couldn't fully comprehend. They had papers that said we owed money for our food and housing, and that we could work off the debt in the copper mines or in towns serving white families. The debt peonage system was a legal fiction that allowed slavery to continue under different names and paperwork. Winona's hands clenched into fists as she described how they had been separated from the few remaining members of their extended family and transported to Copper Ridge in a wagon not unlike the one they now rode in, but with bars on the windows and armed guards who made it clear that escape attempts would be met with violence. They kept us in a room above the saloon for 2 weeks, she said, while Blackstone decided what to do with us, and every day men would come to look at us like we were horses they might buy. As the girls shared their story, Jeb found himself confronting the uncomfortable reality that their suffering was directly connected to the same government and economic system that had employed him as a cavalry scout. The army units he had guided through Apache territory had been protecting mining operations and railroad construction, enforcing policies that treated Native Americans as obstacles to be removed rather than people with legitimate claims to the land their families had occupied for generations. The weight of this realization settled on his shoulders like a lead blanket, because it meant that his current attempt at redemption was really just an effort to undo damage that he had helped create in the first place. Every village burned, every family scattered, every child left orphaned by military action had contributed to the circumstances that brought these 4 girls to Blackstone's auction block. His heroic gesture was actually an attempt to balance scales that his own actions had helped tip toward injustice. But as he watched Kaya laugh for the first time since he had met her, delighting in the way sunlight reflected off the creek water, Jeb realized that the source of the problem mattered less than his current ability to provide a solution. The past couldn't be changed, but the future remained unwritten, and these 4 girls deserved a chance to help write their own stories, rather than having their fate determined by men who saw them as property or problems to be solved. The conversation was interrupted by the sound of approaching hoofbeats, and Jeb felt his military instincts surge back to life as he automatically assessed the terrain for defensive positions and escape routes. 3 riders were approaching from the direction of Copper Ridge, moving at a pace that suggested purpose rather than casual travel, and the way they spread out as they drew closer indicated tactical awareness that marked them as more than simple travelers. Winona heard the horses at the same moment and immediately gathered her sisters into a tight group, her body language shifting from relaxed conversation to combat readiness in a heartbeat. "They found us," she said in a voice that carried no surprise, only grim acceptance of an outcome she had been expecting since the moment they left town. The brief interlude of safety and normalcy was about to end, replaced by the kind of confrontation that Jeb had been hoping to avoid. The lead rider was Bill Morrison, one of Blackstone's foremen, and a man whose reputation for violence was well established throughout the territory. Morrison had the build of someone who had spent years settling disputes with his fists, and the casual way he wore his gun suggested that he was equally comfortable escalating to more permanent solutions. When intimidation proved insufficient, behind him rode 2 younger men who had the hungry look of predators who enjoyed their work. "Afternoon, Clearwater," Morrison called out as he reined in his horse about 20 feet away, close enough to be heard clearly but far enough to avoid being grabbed if the conversation went badly. "Mr. Blackstone sent us to make you a generous offer. On account of he's a reasonable man who believes in giving folks a chance to reconsider their mistakes, before those mistakes become expensive." The words were delivered with a smile that held no warmth whatsoever. Jeb stood slowly, keeping his movements casual while positioning himself between the riders and the girls, and replied, "That's mighty thoughtful of Mr. Blackstone, but I'm generally satisfied with my purchases once I've made them, so I don't expect I'll be needing his generosity today." His tone was conversational, but his right hand hung loose near his gun belt, and Morrison was experienced enough to recognize the posture of a man preparing for violence. "See, that's where you might be mistaken," Morrison continued, his own hand drifting toward his weapon, "because those girls represent a significant investment on Mr. Blackstone's part. What with the transportation costs and legal fees and such. And he's prepared to reimburse you the full $200, plus another $100 for your trouble, assuming you're smart enough to recognize a good deal when you hear one." The offer was clearly intended to sound reasonable, while the underlying threat remained unmistakable. Talia stepped forward before Jeb could respond, her chin raised in the same defiant posture that Winona had displayed on the auction platform, and said in a voice that carried across the desert air like a war cry, "We are not property to be bought and sold, and we will die before we go back to that place." Her words seemed to hang in the air between the two groups, defining the stakes of the confrontation in terms that left no room for compromise. Morrison's expression shifted from false friendliness to open hostility as he realized that negotiation was not going to produce the desired result. "Well now, that's a mighty bold statement from someone who don't have much choice in the matter," he said, his hand now resting openly on his gun butt, "but I reckon we can arrange for you to get your wish about dying if that's really what you prefer to honest work." The pretense of civilized discussion was rapidly dissolving into the kind of naked threat that frontier justice was designed to address. The tension stretched taut as both sides evaluated their options and prepared for whatever came next. Jeb calculated angles and distances with the automatic precision of someone whose survival had once depended on such assessments, while Morrison and his men spread out slightly to maximize their tactical advantage. The girls stood in a tight cluster behind Jeb, ready to scatter if the shooting started, but unwilling to abandon the man who had risked everything to give them a chance at freedom. "I'll give you boys one chance to ride back to town and tell Blackstone that his business with these girls is finished," Jeb said in a voice that carried the quiet authority of someone who had given similar ultimatums before and been prepared to enforce them. "After that, this conversation is going to take a turn that nobody's going to enjoy, and I guarantee that some folks won't be riding home tonight." The words were delivered without bravado or bluster, simply as a statement of fact that Morrison could accept or reject. Morrison laughed, but the sound held no humor, only the harsh amusement of a predator who had cornered prey that thought it might fight back. "You figure you can take all three of us, old man. Even if you're fast as you think you are, which I doubt, somebody's going to put a bullet in you before this is over. And then those girls are coming back with us anyway. Probably in worse condition than they would have been if you'd just taken the money." The logic was brutal but undeniable. "Maybe," Jeb acknowledged, his own hand now hovering near his weapon. "But I've been shot before and lived to tell about it. And I've buried better men than you when they made the mistake of threatening innocent people in my presence." The admission carried the weight of experience rather than bravado, and Morrison seemed to recognize the difference. This wasn't a bluff or a desperate gamble, but the considered decision of someone who had weighed the costs and found them acceptable. The standoff stretched into seconds that felt like hours, with both sides knowing that the next move would determine whether this ended in conversation or gunfire. Behind Jeb, he could hear Winona whispering something in Apache to her sisters, probably instructions about which direction to run when the shooting started. The girls had seen enough violence to know that talk eventually gave way to action, and they were preparing for the worst while hoping for something better. It was Morrison who blinked first, perhaps recognizing something in Jeb's eyes that reminded him of other men who had been willing to die for their principles. "This ain't over, Clearwater," he said as he gathered his reins and prepared to retreat. "Mr. Blackstone has a long memory and plenty of resources, and he don't take kindly to folks who interfere with his business operations. You might have won today, but there's going to be a reckoning, and when it comes, you better hope you're ready for it." As the three riders disappeared back toward Copper Ridge, Jeb realized that he had just declared war on the most powerful man in the territory, a man with unlimited resources and no moral constraints on how he used them. The girls were safe for the moment, but safety was a temporary condition that would require constant vigilance and perhaps ultimate sacrifice to maintain. The choice had been made, and there was no going back. The Clearwater Ranch appeared through the mountain pines like a mirage of peace after 2 days of constant vigilance on the trail. But Jeb's relief was tempered by the knowledge that isolation could be both protection and trap depending on who controlled the approaches. His spread consisted of a modest log cabin, a sturdy barn that had weathered 3 harsh winters, a corral that currently held 6 horses and a handful of cattle, and enough cleared land to grow vegetables and hay if the summer rains cooperated. With his optimistic planning, the girls climbed down from the wagon with the careful movements of people who had learned not to trust apparent safety, their eyes scanning the tree line for hidden threats while simultaneously taking in details that might be important for survival or escape. Winona examined the cabin's construction with the practiced eye of someone evaluating defensive positions, while Talia noted the location of the well, the root cellar, and the various outbuildings that could provide shelter or concealment if circumstances required quick thinking. "The cabin has 2 rooms," Jeb explained as he unhitched the horses, trying to project calm normalcy while his own nerves remained taut with anticipation of pursuit. "The main room with the fireplace and kitchen area, and a smaller bedroom that you 4 can share for as long as you need it. There's blankets and basic supplies, though I admit the cooking arrangements are pretty simple since I never expected to be feeding anyone but myself." The domestic details felt surreal given the violence that had brought them together. Chenoa was the first to venture inside, her natural curiosity overcoming the caution that had kept them all alive during their ordeal, and her soft exclamation of surprise brought the others hurrying to see what had caught her attention. The cabin's interior was spartanly furnished but scrupulously clean, with handmade furniture that spoke of long winter evenings spent crafting necessities from available materials, and shelves lined with books that suggested an educated man's attempt to maintain civilization in the wilderness. Kaya discovered Jeb's collection of hand-carved wooden animals, small figures that he had whittled during sleepless nights when memories of the war made rest impossible, and her delight at the miniature horses and cattle was the first genuine smile any of them had displayed since the auction platform. "Did you make these?" she asked, holding a tiny wooden deer up to the light streaming through the window. And when Jeb nodded, she carefully placed it back among its companions, as if it were made of precious metal rather than pine scraps. 3 days after their arrival at the ranch, a cloud of dust on the southern horizon announced visitors who were definitely not coming for social calls, and Jeb's military experience told him that the approaching party was too large and too organized to be anything other than official business backed by territorial authority. Judge Cornelius Harding rode at the head of a group that included 2 territorial marshals, a court clerk, and enough armed deputies to handle any resistance that might be offered to their proceedings. Judge Harding was a thin man in his 60s, whose black coat and severe expression made him look like an undertaker who specialized in burying justice rather than people, and his reputation for serving the interests of wealthy mine owners was well established throughout the territory. He had been appointed to his position through Blackstone's political connections, and his legal decisions consistently favored business interests over individual rights, making him the perfect instrument for what was clearly a carefully orchestrated legal assault. The judge remained mounted as he addressed Jeb from a safe distance, his voice carrying the formal tone of someone reading from a prepared script designed to provide Legal cover for predetermined actions. Mr. Clearwater, I have here a writ of seizure issued by the Territorial Court in Tucson, authorizing the immediate recovery of stolen property currently being harbored on these premises in violation of territorial law and federal statutes governing the treatment of wards of the Indian Service. The legal language was designed to obscure the reality that 4 traumatized girls were being redefined as property through bureaucratic sleight of hand. But Jeb had heard enough military lawyers to recognize when words were being used as weapons. "Those girls aren't property, Judge," he replied, keeping his voice level despite the rage building in his chest. "And they're not being held here against their will. So I'm not sure what authority you think you have to come onto my land making demands, the authority of territorial law." Harding responded with the smug confidence of someone who had never had his decisions challenged by anyone with the power to enforce opposition, which clearly states that Native Americans currently assigned to reservation systems cannot be removed from federal custody without proper documentation and approval from the appropriate authorities. These individuals were illegally taken from their assigned location and are currently being held in violation of federal statutes governing Indian affairs. The legal trap was beautifully constructed, turning Jeb's act of rescue into a federal crime while simultaneously redefining the girls' status from human beings to government property that had been stolen from its rightful custodians. The fact that their rightful custodians had sold them to Blackstone in the first place was conveniently ignored in the judge's carefully worded proclamation, demonstrating how law could be twisted to serve any purpose when the right people controlled the machinery of justice. Winona stepped out of the cabin before Jeb could respond to the judge's proclamation, her bearing radiating the kind of quiet dignity that made the armed men surrounding her seem small and petty by comparison. "We were not stolen," she said in a voice that carried clearly across the yard. "We were sold like cattle by men who claim to represent our welfare, and if you want to take us back to that place, you will have to kill us first, because we will not go willingly." Her words seemed to hang in the air like a challenge to everything the legal system claimed to represent. And Judge Harding's expression shifted from bureaucratic confidence to visible discomfort as he realized that his carefully prepared script hadn't anticipated dealing with articulate resistance from the supposed property he was there to recover. Native Americans were expected to be silent and compliant, not eloquent and defiant. Talia joined her sister on the porch, her intelligent eyes fixed on the judge with the intensity of someone analyzing an opponent for weaknesses. "Your papers say we belong to the reservation," she said, "but the reservation agent sold us to pay for supplies that never arrived. Supplies that were supposed to keep children from starving while you men in fine clothes decided what was best for us from your offices hundreds of miles away." The accusation hit its target with devastating accuracy, because everyone present knew that the reservation system was riddled with corruption and that supplies intended for Native Americans routinely disappeared into the pockets of white administrators. Judge Harding's discomfort was now visible to his entire party, and Jeb could see some of the deputies exchanging glances that suggested they were beginning to question the righteousness of their mission. Shenoa's voice was softer, but no less powerful when she added, "We have seen what happens to girls who are returned to places where no one watches and no one cares. And we know that your laws are not made to protect people like us. They are made to protect people like him," she gestured toward the judge, "who profit from our suffering while pretending to act in our best interests." The youngest sister, Kaya, surprised everyone by stepping forward and addressing the judge in a voice that carried the fearless honesty that only children possess. "You look like a mean man," she said with devastating simplicity, "and mean men always hurt people weaker than themselves. So we are not going with you no matter what your papers say, because papers cannot make wrong things right." Judge Harding's face flushed red at being lectured by people he considered barely human, and his voice took on the harsh edge of authority challenged by those who were supposed to be powerless. "Marshal Thompson," he barked to the senior lawman in his party, Arrest Mr. Clearwater for harboring fugitive federal wards, and prepare to transport these individuals back to their proper custody, regardless of their personal preferences. In the matter, Marshall Thompson was a career lawman who had spent 20 years enforcing territorial justice, and his weathered face suggested that he had seen enough gray areas to recognize one when it presented itself. "Judge," he said carefully, "these folks don't look like they're being held against their will, and the man seems to be treating them decent. So maybe we could work out some kind of arrangement that doesn't require arresting anybody or forcing children to go places they don't want to go." The suggestion that legal proceedings might consider human decency as a factor clearly infuriated Harding, who had built his career on the principle that law was a tool for enforcing the will of those with power rather than protecting those without it. "Marshal, you will follow your orders or face charges of dereliction of duty," he snapped. "These are not children. They are wards of the federal government who are currently being held illegally by a man with no authority to make decisions regarding their welfare." Jeb stepped forward, his hand resting casually on his gun belt in a gesture that every man present understood perfectly. "Marshal," he said in a voice that carried the quiet authority of someone who had faced death before and found it acceptable, "I bought those girls fair and square in a legal auction witnessed by half the territory, so if anyone's breaking the law here, it's the people who sold them in the first place, not the man who gave them a safe place to sleep." The legal contradiction was obvious to everyone present, because territorial law couldn't simultaneously recognize the auction as legitimate and illegitimate, depending on which outcome served Blackstone's interests better. Either the girls were property that could be legally purchased, or they were human beings who couldn't be sold at all. But the law couldn't have it both ways without admitting that justice was simply a matter of convenience for those with sufficient influence. Marshall Thompson found himself caught between conflicting legal authorities and his own sense of right and wrong, a position that no career lawman wanted to occupy when armed men on both sides were prepared to enforce their interpretation of justice. "Judge," he said slowly, "maybe we need to get some clarification from the territorial capital before we take any irreversible actions here, because this situation seems to have some complications that weren't covered in our original instructions." "Judge." Harding's patience finally snapped completely, revealing the corrupt foundation that supported his interpretation of territorial law. "Marshall Thompson, Mr. Blackstone has invested considerable resources in resolving this situation, and he expects results that justify his confidence in territorial justice," he said, abandoning any pretense that this was about law rather than money. "Now either you arrest that man and recover his property, or I'll find someone who will." The admission that Blackstone was directing legal proceedings from behind the scenes shocked even the most cynical members of the Marshals Party, because it revealed the extent to which territorial justice had been compromised by mining interests. Several deputies exchanged meaningful glances, and Jeb could see that Harding's mask had slipped far enough to expose the ugly reality that everyone had suspected, but no one had been willing to acknowledge openly. "So that's how it works," Talia said with bitter satisfaction. "The rich man tells the judge what to decide, and the judge tells the marshal what to do. And everyone pretends that law and justice are the same thing when they are really just different words for the same lie." Her analysis was devastatingly accurate and impossible to refute, because Harding had just admitted that his legal authority was being exercised on behalf of private interests rather than public welfare. Marshall Thompson's face had gone pale as he realized that his reputation and career were being sacrificed on the altar of Blackstone's business interests, and his voice carried a new edge when he addressed the judge. "Your Honor, with all due respect, I took an oath to enforce territorial law, not to serve as a collection agent for mining companies. And what you're asking me to do here sounds more like kidnapping than law enforcement." The confrontation between judge and marshal created an opening that Jeb was quick to exploit, because divide and conquer tactics had served him well during his military career. "Marshal," he said, "I'm prepared to accompany you to Tucson to sort this out in a proper court with proper procedures. But I'm not turning these girls over to anyone until we get some answers about how federal wards ended up being sold at public auction by the same people who now claim they were stolen." The reasonable proposal put Marshal Thompson in an impossible position, because he couldn't simultaneously serve the interests of justice and the demands of corruption, and his choice would define not only his own character, but the nature of law enforcement in a territory where might and right were often indistinguishable. The silence stretched taut as everyone waited to see which way the scales of territorial justice would tip. Judge Harding's response to the reasonable proposal was to draw a small pistol from inside his coat and point it directly at Winona's chest, abandoning any pretense of legal authority in favor of naked threat. "Enough of this discussion," he snarled. "Those girls are coming with me right now, or someone is going to get hurt, and I guarantee it won't be anyone on my side of this conversation." The judge's desperate action shattered the last vestiges of legal procedure and transformed the situation into exactly the kind of frontier confrontation that Jeb had been hoping to avoid. But his military reflexes kicked in automatically as he assessed threats and responses with the cold calculation of someone who had survived similar situations through decisive action rather than hesitation. Harding was holding his weapon like an amateur, finger tight on the trigger, stance unbalanced, attention focused entirely on his intended target rather than scanning for additional threats. Marshal Thompson's reaction was swift and professional, his own weapon clearing leather with the smooth efficiency of someone who had spent decades practicing the draw. But instead of supporting his supposed superior, he placed the barrel against Judge Harding's temple and said in a voice like winter wind, "Your Honor, you are under arrest for threatening federal wards with a deadly weapon, and if you don't drop that gun right now, I'm going to paint these porch boards with what passes for your brains." The marshal's decision to side with justice over corruption sent shockwaves through both parties, because it represented a fundamental shift in the balance of power that no one had anticipated. Several of Harding's deputies immediately began backing away from a situation that had clearly escalated beyond their comfort level, while others seemed torn between conflicting loyalties and uncertain about which authority they were supposed to obey. Harding's face went white as he realized that his political connections and Blackstone's money meant nothing when faced with a lawman who had decided to enforce actual justice rather than purchased verdicts. His hand trembled as he slowly lowered his weapon, and his voice cracked when he said, "You have no idea what you've just done, Thompson, or who you've made an enemy of by interfering with legitimate business operations." "I know exactly what I've done," the marshal replied as he disarmed the judge and signaled for his deputies to take Harding into custody. "I've remembered what my badge is supposed to stand for, and I've decided that some things are more important than keeping rich men happy, including the safety of 4 girls who never did anything worse than survive when other people wanted them dead." As Judge Harding was led away in shackles that seemed fitting given his attempt to re-enslave the girls he had come to collect, Jeb realized that the corruption of territorial justice ran deeper than anyone had imagined. But that individual conscience could still triumph over systemic evil when good people found the courage to do what was right rather than what was profitable. Marshal Thompson's decision to arrest Judge Harding sent ripples of shock through the territorial power structure that reached all the way to the Capitol in Tucson. But the immediate consequence was that Jeb and the girls found themselves with an unexpected ally who possessed both legal authority and a deep understanding of how Blackstone's influence had corrupted the entire system. Thompson was a man in his 50s who had watched territorial justice slowly transform from a tool of civilization into an instrument of exploitation, and his decision to finally take a stand had liberated him from years of moral compromise. "Clearwater," the marshal said as his deputy secured Harding in the wagon for transport back to Copper Ridge, "I need you to understand that what just happened here is going to bring down more trouble than you can imagine, because Blackstone doesn't just owned judges and mining claims. He owns politicians, newspaper editors, and half the territorial legislature. His warning carried the weight of someone who had seen how power really worked in places where law was still being written by those who benefited most from its flexibility. The Marshal's revelation about the scope of Blackstone's influence was sobering, but it also provided crucial intelligence about the nature of the enemy they were facing. This wasn't just a local dispute between a rancher and a mine owner. It was a battle against a system of corruption that extended from copper mines to territorial courts, involving dozens of officials who had traded their integrity for financial security and political advancement. Winona listened to this conversation with the intense focus of someone who had learned that survival depended on understanding the motivations and capabilities of potential enemies. "How many honest lawmen are there in this territory?" she asked Thompson directly, cutting through the adult's careful diplomatic language to address the core question that would determine their chances of long-term survival. Thompson's answer was brutally honest in the way that only comes from years of bitter experience. "Maybe a dozen out of nearly 100, he said. "And most of those are stationed in remote areas where Blackstone hasn't needed to buy influence yet, so we're essentially on our own when it comes to fighting this thing through legal channels." The admission that territorial law enforcement was nearly entirely compromised forced everyone to confront the reality that justice would have to come from outside the official system. News of Judge Harding's arrest spread through the territory like wildfire, carried by telegraph operators, traveling merchants, and the informal network of communication that connected isolated ranches and mining camps across hundreds of miles of desert and mountain terrain. The story grew in the telling, transforming from a simple arrest into a symbol of resistance against the kind of systematic corruption that had made honest people feel powerless for too long. The first unexpected ally arrived 3 days later, in the form of Father Miguel Santos, a Catholic priest whose mission served the Mexican and Native American communities that the territorial government largely ignored. Father Santos was a small man with intelligent eyes and calloused hands that spoke of someone who believed faith required action rather than just prayer, and his arrival at the ranch represented the beginning of something that none of them had anticipated. "I have been ministering to the families destroyed by Blackstone's operations for 5 years," Father Santos explained as he accepted Jeb's offer of coffee and a place by the fire. "And I have seen children disappear from reservations and Mexican villages, always with official papers that make their slavery look legal to anyone who doesn't examine the documents too closely." His testimony provided crucial evidence that the girl's situation was part of a much larger pattern of systematic human trafficking. The priest had brought with him Maria Consuela, a Mexican woman whose own daughter had disappeared from a mining camp 6 months earlier, and whose desperate search for answers had led her to Father Santos and eventually to stories about 4 native girls who had been rescued from an auction in Copper Ridge. Maria's presence transformed the cabin's atmosphere because her maternal instincts and fierce protective energy created an immediate bond with the girls that crossed cultural and linguistic boundaries. Talia was the first to respond to Maria's gentle questions about their experiences, perhaps recognizing in this older woman the kind of mother figure they had lost when their village was destroyed. The conversation that followed was conducted in a mixture of Spanish, English, and Apache, with translation duties shared among the participants. But the emotional content needed no interpretation as stories of loss, survival, and hope were exchanged. Around the fireplace, within a week, the ranch had become an unofficial headquarters for what Father Santos called La Red de Justicia, the Justice Network, a loose confederation of people whose lives had been damaged by Blackstone's operations, and who had found in the girls' rescue a symbol around which to organize their resistance. The network included Mexican families whose sons had been pressed into dangerous mining work, Native Americans who had escaped from reservations where children were disappearing, and even some white ranchers who had lost their land to Blackstone's expansion. The transformation of the ranch into a center of resistance operations required careful planning and coordination that drew on Jeb's military experience and the girl's intimate knowledge of how Blackstone's trafficking network operated. Winona proved to have an exceptional memory for details about the people and places she had encountered during her captivity, while Talia's analytical mind was perfectly suited to identifying patterns and connections that others might miss. Chenoa contributed her knowledge of traditional Apache scouting techniques, teaching the network's volunteers how to move through the desert terrain without leaving tracks and how to observe enemy positions without being detected. Her gentle demeanor concealed a thorough understanding of surveillance and counter-surveillance that had been passed down through generations of people who had needed to avoid military patrols and survive in hostile territory. Even young Kaya found a role in the intelligence operation, using her artistic talents to create detailed maps and sketches of the locations where she and her sisters had been held, including floor plans of buildings and portraits of guards and officials that could be used to identify key figures in Blackstone's organization. Her drawings were remarkably detailed and accurate, suggesting a natural talent for observation that had been sharpened by the necessity of watching for threats. The intelligence picture that emerged from these combined efforts was far more disturbing than anyone had initially realized, revealing a network of corruption and exploitation that extended across 3 territories and involved dozens of officials, businessmen, and criminals who had found profitable ways to collaborate in the systematic destruction of Native and Mexican communities. Children were being harvested from reservations and border towns, processed through fake auctions and illegal contracts, and distributed to mining camps, ranches, and private homes where they disappeared from any kind of official oversight. Father Santos contributed crucial information about the financial aspects of the operation, having spent months tracking the money flows that connected charitable donations intended for reservation schools with the private accounts of officials who were supposed to be protecting Native children. "They are not just stealing children," he explained. "They are stealing the money that is supposed to feed and educate them, creating a double profit while making the victims pay for their own enslavement." The network's intelligence gathering efforts were aided by an unexpected source when Sarah Whitmore, the territorial telegraph operator in Copper Ridge, began secretly copying messages that passed through her office and sharing them with Maria Consuela during her weekly trips to town for supplies. Sarah was a widow whose own moral awakening had been triggered by overhearing conversations about the auction, and her access to communications between Blackstone and his political allies provided invaluable insight into their planning and operations. As word of the Justice Network spread through the informal channels that connected oppressed communities across the territory, volunteers began arriving at the ranch with offers of assistance that ranged from practical support to specialized skills that proved invaluable in building an effective resistance organization. Former soldiers brought tactical knowledge and weapons training, while teachers and clergy provided literacy instruction and moral guidance to people who had been denied both. One of the most important arrivals was Dr. Catherine Morrison, a physician whose medical practice in Tucson had been destroyed when she refused to certify that Native children were mentally deficient and therefore suitable for indentured servitude. Dr. Morrison was a woman in her 40s whose professional training and moral convictions had made her a natural enemy of Blackstone's operations, and her decision to join the network provided crucial medical expertise for treating the physical and psychological trauma that characterized most of the rescued victims. The doctor's examination of the 4 girls revealed evidence of systematic abuse that went far beyond what they had been willing to discuss, including signs of malnutrition, untreated injuries, and psychological conditioning designed to break their spirits and make them compliant. Her detailed medical reports provided legal documentation that could be used in court proceedings, but more importantly, her treatment helped the girls begin the long process of healing from their ordeal. The network's growth also attracted The attention of James Fitzgerald, a newspaper editor from Phoenix whose publication had been financially ruined when he refused to print stories that supported Blackstone's version of territorial development. Fitzgerald brought with him not only journalistic skills, but also a network of contacts in Eastern newspapers who were interested in stories about corruption and human rights violations in the Western Territories. Fitzgerald's investigation into the auction that had brought the girls to Jeb's attention revealed that similar events were being held regularly throughout the territory, always with legal documentation that appeared legitimate but fell apart under careful scrutiny. His articles, published in newspapers from Denver to San Francisco, began to attract attention from federal officials who had previously been unaware of the scope of the problem. The network's activities were not limited to intelligence gathering and publicity, however, as volunteers began conducting rescue operations that freed other victims from situations similar to what the girls had experienced. These operations required careful planning and precise execution, because any failure would not only result in the loss of innocent lives, but would also provide Blackstone with evidence that could be used to justify increased security measures and harsher treatment of potential victims. Blackstone's response to the growing resistance was swift and brutal, beginning with economic warfare designed to destroy the livelihoods of anyone associated with the Justice Network. Ranchers who had provided support found their cattle buyers suddenly unwilling to purchase their herds, while merchants discovered that their credit had been mysteriously canceled and their suppliers were no longer able to fulfill orders. The economic pressure was accompanied by a campaign of intimidation that targeted the families of network members, with mysterious fires destroying barns and crops, livestock disappearing in the night, and threatening messages left where children would find them. The psychological warfare was designed to break the resolve of people who might be willing to risk their own safety, but couldn't bear to see their loved ones suffer for their choices. Father Santos became a particular target of Blackstone's wrath when his church was vandalized and his congregation was told that anyone who continued to attend services would find themselves unemployed and evicted from company housing. The attack on religious freedom crossed a line that even some of Blackstone's allies found disturbing, but it also demonstrated the extent to which he was willing to go to crush any organized opposition to his operations. The network's response to these attacks was to accelerate their rescue operations while simultaneously building stronger defensive positions around the ranch and other safe locations. Jeb's military experience proved invaluable in organizing these defenses, but it was Winona's leadership that held the diverse group together during the increasingly dangerous confrontations with Blackstone's forces. The girls had evolved from victims into leaders, with each sister taking responsibility for different aspects of the resistance effort. Winona coordinated tactical operations, Talia managed intelligence analysis, Shenoa oversaw medical and psychological support for rescued victims, and even young Kaya contributed by maintaining communication networks and providing artistic documentation of their activities. The transformation of 4 traumatized children into effective resistance leaders represented a victory that went beyond the immediate tactical situation, because it demonstrated that Blackstone's system of exploitation could not only be fought, but could actually create the very leaders who would ultimately destroy it. Their courage and competence inspired other victims to believe that survival was possible and that resistance could succeed. The network's success in freeing other victims and building public support for their cause had reached a point where Blackstone could no longer rely on quiet intimidation and legal maneuvering to achieve his objectives. The stakes had escalated to the point where direct confrontation was inevitable, and both sides began preparing for a battle that would determine not just the fate of 4 girls, but the future of justice in the entire territory. The community that had awakened around their rescue was about to face its greatest test. The arrival of Federal Marshal William Harrison from Denver changed everything about the legal landscape surrounding the case, because his authority superseded territorial jurisdiction, and his reputation for incorruptible enforcement of federal law made him immune to the kind of financial pressure that Blackstone routinely applied to local officials. Harrison was a man in his early 50s whose gray beard and steady eyes suggested someone who had seen enough frontier justice to recognize the difference between law and vengeance, and his presence in Copper Ridge sent shockwaves through the network of corruption that had previously operated with impunity. Harrison's investigation into the circumstances surrounding the girls' auction had been triggered by James Fitzgerald's newspaper articles, which had reached congressional representatives, who demanded answers about human trafficking in territories that were supposedly under federal protection. The marshal brought with him a team of federal attorneys, court stenographers, and investigators whose presence transformed Copper Ridge from a remote mining town into the center of national attention, with reporters arriving daily from newspapers in Denver, San Francisco, and even New York. The federal investigation team established their headquarters in the Copper Ridge Hotel, much to the dismay of the local establishment that had grown comfortable with Blackstone's version of law and order. Their methodical approach to gathering evidence included interviews with dozens of witnesses, examination of financial records that Blackstone had assumed would never be scrutinized, and careful documentation of the physical evidence of systematic abuse that the girls and other victims had endured. Federal Marshal Harrison's first priority was to ensure the safety of all potential witnesses, because his experience with corruption cases had taught him that desperate criminals would often resort to intimidation or violence to prevent testimony that could destroy them. He established a protective detail for the ranch and arranged for secure transportation for anyone who needed to travel to give testimony or provide evidence to federal investigators. The marshal's background investigation into Blackstone's operations revealed connections to similar trafficking networks in Colorado, New Mexico, and California, suggesting that the Copper Ridge operation was part of a much larger criminal enterprise that had been exploiting jurisdictional gaps between federal and territorial authority. This discovery elevated the case from a local crime to a federal conspiracy that required coordination between law enforcement agencies across multiple territories. The federal team's resources and expertise allowed them to pursue investigative leads that the Justice Network had identified, but lacked the authority or capability to fully explore. Financial records that had been hidden in banks across 3 territories were subpoenaed and analyzed, revealing a complex web of payments, bribes, and profit-sharing arrangements that connected dozens of officials and businessmen in a systematic criminal conspiracy. The federal grand jury proceedings were conducted in Denver rather than in any territorial court, removing the case from the sphere of influence that Blackstone had spent years cultivating among local officials. The grand jury was composed of citizens from throughout the federal district, ensuring that Blackstone's money and influence would have minimal impact on their deliberations about whether criminal charges were warranted, known as testimony. Before the grand jury was conducted with the assistance of a federal interpreter who specialized in Apache languages, ensuring that her account of the trafficking network would be recorded accurately and completely. Her exceptional memory and analytical abilities allowed her to provide detailed information about the organizational structure of the criminal enterprise, including names, locations, and financial arrangements that federal investigators had been unable to discover through other means. The grand jury heard testimony from over 40 witnesses during 3 weeks of proceedings that systematically dismantled any possible defense that Blackstone's operations had been legal or legitimate. The evidence presented included forged documents, fraudulent contracts, testimony from other victims, financial records showing systematic bribery of government officials, and medical evidence of abuse that could not be explained away as cultural misunderstanding or legitimate discipline. Talia's testimony was particularly effective because her analytical skills allowed her to explain the legal mechanisms that had been used to create the appearance of legitimacy around what was actually systematic enslavement. She walked the grand jury through the process, by which reservation children were classified as debtors through manipulated accounting, then transferred to creditors who were actually slave buyers operating under the protection of territorial law. The grand jury's examination of territorial court records revealed that Judge Harding had ruled in favor of Blackstone's interests in over 90% of cases involving labor disputes, land claims, or criminal charges that affected the mining operations. This pattern of bias was so extreme that it constituted evidence of systematic corruption rather than merely poor judicial decision-making. Chenoa's medical testimony, supported by Dr. Morrison's expert analysis, provided the grand jury with graphic evidence of the physical and psychological abuse that characterized Blackstone's operations. Her gentle demeanor and obvious sincerity made her testimony particularly powerful, because it was impossible to dismiss her accounts as exaggeration or fabrication when the evidence of trauma was so clearly documented. Young Kaya's artistic documentation of the places where she and her sisters had been held provided the grand jury with visual evidence that corroborated the verbal testimony of other witnesses. Her drawings were remarkably detailed and accurate, showing floor plans, guard positions, and identifying characteristics of key figures in the trafficking network that federal investigators were able to verify through independent investigation. The grand jury's final session included testimony from federal banking investigators who had traced financial flows between Blackstone's operations and government officials throughout the territory. These financial records proved that corruption was not limited to a few isolated individuals but involved systematic bribery that had compromised territorial justice at every level, from local sheriffs to territorial Supreme Court justices. Ezra Blackstone's response to the federal investigation was to hire the most expensive legal team that money could buy, led by Senator James Whitfield, a former territorial governor who had left politics to establish one of the most successful law practices in the West. Whitfield was a man who specialized in defending the indefensible by using legal technicalities and procedural challenges to confuse juries and exhaust prosecutors, and his reputation for winning hopeless cases had made him the preferred attorney for wealthy criminals throughout the Western territories. The defense strategy was built around multiple layers of legal argumentation, designed to create reasonable doubt about Blackstone's criminal intent, the legitimacy of federal jurisdiction, and the credibility of witnesses whose testimony formed the foundation of the prosecution's case. Whitfield's team included specialists in federal Indian law, territorial jurisdiction, and criminal procedure who were tasked with finding any possible weakness in the prosecution's legal foundation. The defense's primary argument centered on the claim that Blackstone had been operating within the bounds of territorial law as it existed at the time of the auction, and that any subsequent changes in federal policy could not be applied retroactively to punish actions that were legal when they occurred. This approach required the defense to argue that human beings could legitimately be treated as property under certain circumstances, a position that was morally repugnant but legally complex given the confused state of territorial law regarding Native American rights. Whitfield's team also prepared to challenge federal jurisdiction by arguing that the crimes had occurred entirely within territorial boundaries and that federal intervention violated territorial sovereignty as established by congressional legislation governing the admission of new states. This jurisdictional challenge was designed to force the prosecution to prove that interstate commerce had been affected, a requirement that could potentially invalidate all federal charges if successfully argued. The defense's most controversial strategy involved attempting to discredit the girls' testimony by questioning their mental capacity, cultural understanding of legal concepts, and ability to distinguish between voluntary servitude and slavery. This approach required the defense to argue that Native American children were inherently unreliable witnesses due to cultural differences and alleged intellectual deficiencies, a position that reflected the racist assumptions underlying much of territorial law. Blackstone's legal team conducted extensive research into Jebb's military service and post-war activities, looking for evidence that could be used to portray him as an unstable war veteran who had kidnapped the girls for his own purposes and had coached them to provide false testimony. This line of attack required careful investigation of his cavalry service, his brief career as a hired gun, and his decision to retreat to an isolated ranch where he lived alone for several years. The defense also prepared character witnesses who would testify to Blackstone's contributions to territorial development and his reputation as a legitimate businessman whose mining operations had provided employment and economic growth for hundreds of families. These witnesses included territorial politicians, business leaders, and community figures who had benefited from Blackstone's financial generosity over the years. Whitfield's team recognized that their client's personality and demeanor posed significant challenges for his defense, because his arrogance and contempt for anyone he considered inferior made it difficult for him to project the kind of sympathetic image that might sway a jury. They spent weeks coaching him on courtroom behavior, testimony delivery, and emotional control, but his fundamental character traits proved resistant to modification. Federal prosecutor Sarah Mitchell was a woman whose reputation for methodical preparation and relentless pursuit of justice had been built through successful prosecutions of corruption cases throughout the Western Territories. Her decision to personally handle the Blackstone case signaled federal determination to use this trial as a warning to other criminals who might be tempted to exploit federal jurisdictional gaps for personal profit, and her presence attracted national attention to what might otherwise have been dismissed as a local territorial dispute. Mitchell's prosecution team included specialists in federal criminal law, Native American legal rights, and financial crime who had been assembled specifically to ensure that no aspect of Blackstone's criminal enterprise would escape legal accountability. Their preparation included months of investigation, witness interviews, document analysis, and coordination with law enforcement agencies across multiple territories and states. The prosecution's opening statement was a masterpiece of legal rhetoric that combined emotional appeal with rigorous legal analysis. Beginning with a detailed description of the auction, where 4 children had been sold like livestock, and building toward a comprehensive explanation of how federal law was designed to prevent exactly this kind of exploitation. Mitchell's presentation made it clear that this was not just a case about 4 girls, but about the fundamental question of whether human rights would be protected or abandoned in the American territories. The prosecution's case was built around 3 distinct but interconnected legal theories that demonstrated criminal intent, systematic operation, and clear federal jurisdiction. The first theory established that Blackstone had knowingly participated in human trafficking by purchasing children from reservation officials who had no legal authority to sell them, regardless of what paperwork had been generated to create the appearance of legitimacy under territorial law. Mitchell's team presented financial evidence showing that Blackstone had made systematic payments to reservation agents, territorial judges, and law enforcement officials who facilitated the trafficking operation by providing legal cover and preventing investigation of obvious criminal activity. These financial records prove that the apparent legality of the auctions was actually the result of systematic bribery rather than legitimate legal authority. The second legal theory proved that the trafficking operation was systematic rather than accidental, using communication intercepts, witness testimony, and operational records to demonstrate that Blackstone had established a network of suppliers, transporters, and customers who collaborated to harvest children from vulnerable communities and distribute them to buyers throughout the Western Territories. This evidence transformed what might have been dismissed as isolated incidents into proof of organized criminal enterprise. The prosecution's evidence included testimony from rescued victims who described assembly line processing at collection points where children were evaluated, categorized, and prepared for distribution to specific types of buyers. Medical examinations, behavioral assessments, and skills testing were used to determine which children would be sent to mines, ranches, domestic service, or other forms of exploitation based on customer specifications. The third legal theory established federal jurisdiction by proving that the trafficking network crossed territorial and state boundaries, violated federal treaties with Native American tribes, and interfered with federal authority over reservation systems and interstate commerce. This jurisdictional foundation was essential for ensuring that any convictions would survive appeals and establish precedents that could be used in future cases involving territorial crime. Mitchell's presentation of evidence regarding treaty violations was particularly powerful because it demonstrated that Blackstone's operations had not only harmed individual victims, but it also undermined federal relationships with Native American tribes that were essential for maintaining peace and stability throughout the Western Territories. The systematic violation of federal treaty obligations elevated the case from simple criminal prosecution to a matter of national security and international law. The trial's most emotionally powerful and legally significant moments came when the four sisters provided their testimony about the trafficking network and their experiences within it. Each girl contributed different perspectives and information that together created a comprehensive picture of systematic criminal enterprise that no defense strategy could successfully challenge or discredit. Winona's testimony was the prosecution's centerpiece because her leadership role and exceptional memory had given her access to information about the network's organizational structure, financial operations, and connections to government officials that even federal investigators had been unable to discover through other means. Her detailed accounts of conversations between traffickers, descriptions of operational procedures, and identification of key figures provided crucial evidence for multiple aspects of the prosecution's case. Talia's analytical testimony helped the jury understand how legal mechanisms had been manipulated to create the appearance of legitimacy around systematic enslavement, while her descriptions of the psychological techniques used to control victims demonstrated the sophisticated and systematic nature of the criminal enterprise. Her intelligence and articulate presentation made it impossible for the defense to dismiss her as an unreliable witness. Chenoa's gentle but powerful testimony about the human cost of trafficking operations provided emotional weight that balanced the technical legal arguments, while her descriptions of the healing process that had begun at Jeb's ranch demonstrated the possibility of recovery and the importance of justice for victims of systematic abuse. Her obvious sincerity and dignity made her testimony unassailable. Even young Kaya's testimony proved crucial, because her innocent questions about why adults had hurt children who had done nothing wrong cut through legal complexity to address the fundamental moral issues at stake in the trial. Her artistic documentation of abuse and her descriptions of fear and confusion provided powerful evidence that no technical legal arguments could diminish. The defense's cross-examination of the girls backfired spectacularly when their attempts to confuse or intimidate the witnesses only demonstrated the victims' courage and intelligence while revealing the moral bankruptcy of anyone who would attack traumatized children in order to protect their abusers. The jury's obvious sympathy for the girls and disgust with the defense's tactics severely damaged Blackstone's chances for acquittal. Jeb's testimony provided crucial corroborating evidence while demonstrating the moral courage that had made the rescue possible, and his descriptions of the girls' condition when he found them offered powerful proof of the systematic abuse they had endured. His military background and obvious integrity made him an unimpeachable witness, whose testimony could not be successfully challenged by the defense. The prosecution's final arguments tied together all the evidence and testimony into a comprehensive demonstration of guilt that left no reasonable doubt about Blackstone's criminal responsibility for systematic human trafficking, corruption of government officials, and violation of federal law. Mitchell's closing statement was a powerful call for justice. that resonated with jury members who had been moved by the testimony of brave victims and outraged by the evidence of systematic exploitation. The jury's deliberation lasted only 6 hours, an unusually short time for such a complex federal case. But the evidence had been so overwhelming and the testimony so compelling that extended discussion proved unnecessary. When the 12 men filed back into the Denver courthouse at 4 o'clock on that crisp October afternoon, their solemn faces told the story before the foreman ever spoke the words that would echo through territorial history for generations to come. We, the jury, find the defendant Ezra Blackstone guilty on all counts of human trafficking, conspiracy to violate federal law, bribery of government officials, and violation of federal treaties with sovereign Native American nations. The foreman announced in a voice that carried to every corner of the packed courtroom. The explosion of celebration from the gallery had to be quieted by federal marshals, but not before cheers and applause had continued for nearly 5 minutes as spectators expressed their joy at seeing justice finally triumph over corruption and wealth. Ezra Blackstone's face went ashen as the verdict was read, his arrogance finally cracking to reveal the frightened old man beneath the facade of untouchable power. His expensive attorney, Senator Whitfield, immediately began preparing appeals and procedural challenges, but everyone in the courtroom understood that the evidence had been too comprehensive and the testimony too credible for any appellate court to overturn such a decisive verdict. Federal Judge Catherine Morrison, who had been brought in from San Francisco specifically to preside over this historic case, wasted no time in delivering a sentence that would send shockwaves through every corrupt territorial government from Arizona to Montana. "Mr. Blackstone," she said in a voice that carried the weight of federal authority, "you are hereby sentenced to 25 years in federal prison, with no possibility of parole for 15 years, and your entire business empire is forfeit to the federal government for victim compensation and territorial law enforcement reform." The systematic destruction of Blackstone's wealth was perhaps even more significant than his imprisonment, because it demonstrated that federal law could reach beyond individual criminals to dismantle the economic foundations of systematic corruption. Every mine, every business, every property, and every financial account would be liquidated, with the proceeds used to establish permanent institutions dedicated to preventing similar crimes and helping victims rebuild their lives. Judge Harding and the other territorial officials who had participated in the trafficking network received sentences ranging from 8 to 18 years, effectively decapitating the corruption network that had made the criminal enterprise possible. Their prosecutions established legal precedents that would make it much more difficult for future criminals to corrupt territorial justice systems, while sending a clear message that federal law would protect vulnerable populations regardless of local political arrangements. The trial's conclusion was marked by legal proceedings that transformed the four sisters from trafficking victims into full American citizens with all the rights and protections that status entailed. Federal Judge Morrison personally presided over the citizenship ceremony, using emergency powers granted by Congress to expedite the process for trafficking survivors whose previous legal status had been deliberately obscured by their captors. Winona's oath of citizenship was administered in both English and Apache, with federal interpreters ensuring that she fully understood the rights and responsibilities she was accepting. At 19, she became the youngest Native American woman in territorial history to achieve citizenship through federal court proceedings, and her articulate responses to the judge's questions demonstrated the intelligence and dignity that had made her such a powerful witness. The formal adoption of all 4 girls by Jeb was conducted immediately following the citizenship ceremony, transforming their rescue from a temporary arrangement into a permanent family relationship that could not be challenged by any remaining Blackstone allies or corrupt territorial officials. The adoption papers were signed by Federal Judge Morrison herself, ensuring that the proceedings carried the full weight of federal authority. Talia's new legal status included provisions for educational opportunities that had previously been denied to Native children, with federal funding allocated specifically for her advanced studies in law and government. Her analytical abilities and deep understanding of how legal systems could be manipulated to harm vulnerable populations made her an ideal candidate for future work in federal Indian law and civil rights advocacy. Chenoa's adoption papers included special provisions recognizing her traditional healing knowledge and authorizing her to practice traditional medicine alongside any formal medical training she might pursue. This legal recognition of Native healing traditions was groundbreaking, representing the first time federal law had formally acknowledged the validity and value of indigenous medical practices. Young Kaya's adoption was accompanied by the establishment of a federal education fund that would support her artistic development and ensure that her exceptional talents for observation and documentation could be cultivated through formal training. Her drawings had provided crucial evidence in the trial, and federal authorities recognized that her unique abilities could be valuable for future law enforcement investigations. The legal transformation of the girls from property to citizens to family members represented a complete reversal of the dehumanization they had experienced under Blackstone's system. But more importantly, it established legal precedents that would protect other Native children from similar exploitation. Their case became the foundation for new federal laws governing the treatment of indigenous populations in all American territories. The establishment of the Clearwater Foundation for Territorial Justice, funded by Blackstone's seized assets, provided a permanent institutional framework for continuing the work that the Justice Network had begun. The Foundation's headquarters was established in the former Blackstone Mansion in Copper Ridge, transforming the symbol of corruption into a center for victim advocacy and legal reform. Father Miguel Santos was appointed as the Foundation's Director of Community Outreach, bringing his deep understanding of the cultural and spiritual needs of trafficking survivors to the development of comprehensive recovery programs. His work included establishing safe houses in communities throughout the territory, training local officials to recognize signs of human trafficking, and creating communication networks that would make it impossible for future criminal enterprises to operate in secret. Dr. Catherine Morrison became the Foundation's Chief Medical Officer, using her expertise in treating trauma survivors to develop innovative therapeutic approaches that combine traditional Western medicine with indigenous healing practices. Her medical protocols became the national standard for treating trafficking victims, and her training programs for frontier doctors ensured that help would be available even in the most remote territorial communities. Maria Consuelo was hired as the Foundation's chief victim advocate, using her personal experience with loss and her natural gifts for providing emotional support to help other families navigate the process of healing and recovery. Her work included establishing family reunification programs, providing legal assistance for survivors seeking citizenship or land rights, and creating support networks for parents whose children had been victims of trafficking. The transformation of Copper Ridge from a center of corruption into a model community for territorial justice was perhaps the Foundation's most visible achievement, because it demonstrated that systematic change was possible when communities found the courage to resist exploitation and demand accountability from their leaders. The town's rehabilitation became a symbol of what was possible when federal law was enforced consistently and fairly. Marshal Thompson was promoted to Chief Federal Marshal for the Arizona Territory, with specific responsibility for implementing the new law enforcement protocols that had emerged from the Blackstone investigation. His personal transformation from a conflicted territorial lawman to a federal champion of justice embodied the broader changes that were sweeping through territorial government as corruption was replaced by accountability. The Justice Network evolved into a permanent civil rights organization with chapters throughout the Western Territories, providing ongoing advocacy for vulnerable populations and monitoring government officials for signs of corruption or abuse of power. The network's success in exposing and defeating Blackstone's criminal enterprise had demonstrated that ordinary citizens could challenge even the most entrenched corruption when they worked together with courage and determination. Sarah Whitmore was appointed as the Territorial Telegraph Superintendent, using her position to ensure that communications between territorial officials would be monitored for signs of conspiracy or corruption. Her courage in exposing Blackstone's communications had been crucial to the prosecution's success, and her new role ensured that similar criminal enterprises would find it much more difficult to coordinate their activities in secret. 5 years after the trial, Winona had completed her education and become the first Native American woman admitted to practice law in the Arizona Territory, specializing in federal Indian law and representing tribes in treaty negotiations with the federal government. Her exceptional memory and analytical abilities, combined with her personal experience as a trafficking survivor, made her uniquely qualified to protect other Native communities from legal exploitation. Winona's law practice was based in Phoenix, but she maintained close ties to the Clearwater Foundation and frequently returned to the ranch to visit her adoptive father and coordinate legal strategies with other advocates. Her success demonstrated that trafficking survivors could not only recover from their trauma, but could become powerful advocates for justice and social change. Her most significant legal victory came when she successfully argued before the Territorial Supreme Court that all previous land transactions involving fraudulent representation of Native interests should be voided and the affected territories returned to tribal control. This landmark decision restored thousands of acres to Native communities and established legal precedents that protected indigenous land rights throughout the Western Territories. Talia had pursued advanced studies in government and economics, becoming an expert in the financial mechanisms that criminals use to exploit vulnerable populations. Her work with federal investigators had led to the exposure of several other trafficking networks, and her analytical reports had become essential reading for law enforcement officials throughout the Western Territories. At 21, Talia was appointed as the federal government's youngest territorial inspector, with authority to investigate any government official suspected of corruption or abuse of power. Her appointment represented federal recognition that trafficking survivors possessed unique insights into how criminal systems operated and how they could be defeated through systematic investigation and prosecution. Her most important contribution was the development of financial auditing procedures that made it virtually impossible for government officials to hide bribes or other corrupt payments. These procedures were implemented throughout the territorial system, creating transparency that prevented the kind of systematic corruption that had made Blackstone's criminal enterprise possible. Chenoa had combined traditional Apache healing knowledge with formal medical training, becoming a pioneering practitioner of what would later be called integrative medicine. Her work with trauma survivors demonstrated that healing required attention to spiritual and cultural needs as well as physical symptoms, and her treatment protocols were adopted by medical professionals throughout the Western Territories. Her clinic in Tucson became a center for training medical professionals to work with trafficking survivors and other trauma victims, combining the latest advances in medical science with traditional healing practices that had sustained Native communities for generations. Her work represented a groundbreaking synthesis of different healing traditions that produced better outcomes for patients than either approach could achieve alone. Chenoa's research into the long-term effects of trafficking trauma led to new understanding of how systematic abuse affected brain development and emotional regulation, contributing to advances in psychological treatment that helped thousands of survivors rebuild their lives. Her published articles became standard references for medical professionals working with trauma survivors throughout the United States. Young Kaya had developed her artistic talents into a powerful tool for social change, creating paintings and sculptures that documented the experiences of trafficking survivors and educated the public about ongoing threats to vulnerable populations. Her artwork was displayed in galleries from San Francisco to New York, bringing national attention to issues that might otherwise have been ignored by urban audiences. Her most famous work was a series of paintings depicting the transformation of trafficking survivors from victims to advocates, showing how trauma could be overcome through community support and individual courage. These paintings became symbols of hope for survivors throughout the country and raised thousands of dollars for victim advocacy organizations. Kaya's artistic documentation of the trial and its aftermath created a visual record of historic events that supplemented the written accounts preserved in court records and newspaper reports. Her drawings and paintings provided future historians with intimate perspectives on how systematic corruption was exposed and defeated through the courage of ordinary people who refused to accept injustice. The legal precedents established by the Blackstone case fundamentally transformed federal law regarding human trafficking, territorial jurisdiction, and the protection of indigenous populations. Congressional legislation inspired by the case created permanent federal oversight of territorial governments, mandatory reporting systems for missing children, and enhanced penalties for officials who participated in corruption schemes. The Federal Anti-Trafficking Act of 1883 was directly based on evidence and legal arguments developed during the Blackstone prosecution, creating comprehensive federal jurisdiction over crimes involving the transportation of victims across territorial or state boundaries. This legislation closed the jurisdictional gaps that had allowed trafficking networks to operate with impunity, ensuring that future criminals would face federal prosecution regardless of local political arrangements. The establishment of federal oversight offices in every territorial capital created permanent institutions dedicated to monitoring government officials for signs of corruption and investigating reports of missing or exploited children. These offices were staffed by federal employees whose salaries and authority came directly from Washington, making them immune to local political pressure or financial inducement. The Clearwater Foundation's work expanded far beyond the Arizona territory, establishing chapters in 12 territories and states where trafficking networks had been identified. The Foundation's success in combining victim advocacy with systematic investigation and legal reform created a model that was replicated by similar organizations throughout the United States. Educational programs developed by the Foundation ensured that future generations would understand the warning signs of trafficking and the importance of reporting suspicious activities to federal authorities. These programs were implemented in schools, churches, and community organizations throughout the Western Territories, creating a network of informed citizens who could recognize and resist criminal exploitation. The transformation of Copper Ridge became a case study in community rehabilitation that was studied by government officials and social reformers throughout the United States. The town's evolution from a center of corruption to a model community demonstrated that systematic change was possible when citizens found the courage to demand justice, and federal authorities provided consistent support for reform efforts. The ranch where it all began remained the family home for Jeb and the four sisters, but it also became a place of pilgrimage for trafficking survivors and advocates from throughout the country. Visitors came to see where four traumatized children had found safety and healing, and where their courage had sparked a movement that transformed territorial justice throughout the American West. The story of Jeremiah Clearwater and the four sisters became a legend that was told and retold throughout the territories, inspiring other ordinary citizens to find the courage to confront injustice and corruption in their own communities. Their example demonstrated that individual moral choices could have consequences that extended far beyond their immediate circumstances, creating ripple effects that transformed entire social systems. 20 years after the trial, when Arizona achieved statehood, Winona was elected as the state's first Native American representative to Congress, while Talia became the state's first female attorney general. Their political success represented the complete transformation of people who had once been treated as property into leaders who would shape the future of American democracy. The four sisters never forgot that their rescue had been made possible by one man's decision to risk everything for strangers, and their subsequent achievements were dedicated to ensuring that other victims would find the protection and support they needed to rebuild their lives. Their story proved that courage was contagious, and that justice was possible when people refused to accept that suffering was inevitable.
Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.